Today we are going to be covering Chapter 16, Lesson 4, still within our evolution unit. In this one, we're going to look at some different pieces of evidence that are used to support the idea of evolution. So, a lot of this is based on Darwin's experiences as he traveled around. So it's called biogeography, which just means we're studying where organisms live now and where they and their ancestors lived in the past. So this involves studying the fossil record and comparing that to living species so that we can see how modern organisms might have changed from their ancestors. And it led to two um, kind of different ways of thinking about it. So there's closely related but different. So within one area, having populations that are similar, but they're not exactly the same. Okay, so they're closely related, but they have their differences to make them distinctive from one another. And then there's distantly related but similar. So this is organisms that live in different locations but inhabit similar ecos. Sorry, not ecosystems. Inhabit similar habitats. Okay, or have similar body structures that would um, make them or allow them to have those similar habitats or similar jobs within their ecosystem. So radioactive dating places the Earth at approximately 4.5 billion years old. We are still constantly finding new fossils, but it's still a very incomplete record. The fossil record is honestly probably not the best source of evidence. A lot of the fossils that we find are incomplete. Um, it's very rare to find a complete fossilized skeleton of anything. Um, so the fossil record can be misleading. One thing that we do, or one set of um, I guess one set of information that we use as evidence is to compare either anatomy or embryology. So we're going to start by looking at how we can compare anatomy, which is far more functional than comparing the embryology, but we'll get there. So there are homologous structures and analogous structures, and they tend to be very confusing. So homologous structures are inherited from a common ancestor. So it's a structure that is used for the same purpose. Uh, sorry. It's a structure that you have they have common roots, but they are maybe used for slightly different purposes. So homologous structures would be like our forearm, right? And your cat or your dog's front leg. Okay. Very similar structures actually, but different purposes. Okay. We don't use ours to walk. Um, Analogous structures are sometimes described as a common solution, but they came about it differently, like a bat wing versus a bee wing. So a bat's wing has bones on the inside because they're a mammal, and a bee wing does not, but they're both used for flying. So they would be analogous. Okay. They serve the same function, but they don't have the same structure. Okay, whereas homologous has the same structure, but maybe a little different function. And then there are vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are those that we inherited from our ancestors. We still have these structures, but they maybe don't serve the same purpose that they once did. The appendix is frequently identified as one of these structures, but really, it's not so much that the appendix has probably lost its function. Um, yes, you can survive without it, but it's better if you have it. We have learned recently that it actually plays a role in your immune system. So if you if it's causing you problems, then removing it is the better option. Um, but and you can survive without it, but it does have a job to play. It does have a job that it does. So again, here's analogous structures versus homologous structures. Analogous structures, comparing a bat's wings with a bird's wings with a dragonfly. Um, so the bat and bird wings might be actually more homologous in their bone structure that's inside, and then they would be analogous to the insect wing. And then the homologous structures here showing a human arm with a cat's front leg, the fin of a whale, and a bat's wings. So we actually have very similar bone structure. You can see those highlighted, they color coded all of them. Um, so we have that similarity, but we use all of these for different things, right? So we use our arms for like lifting and grabbing things, whereas a whale is going to use its fin just to push through the water and maintain balance, and a bat's going to use its wings to fly. So same structure, but very different functions, analogous, similar function, but they can have different structure to them. All right, embryology. Embryology is the study of like embryological development. So for humans, it's the first 8 weeks, but really they're studying like basically from fertilization all the way through to when you're actually like your own organism. Okay. So for humans, it would be birth, but it might be like hatching for some of these. The problem with this, as you can see with these drawings, so we're comparing, these are really hard to see on some of them are obvious, like this one's a turtle. So here we're comparing like a turtle, a duck, and a pig, I think. So the earliest stages of embryological development have a lot of similarity, and then you get, as the development progresses, you get very distinctive looking. The big problem with the embryological development as a source of evidence for evolution is that the pictures are wrong. And so they're kind of drawn to look more similar than they actually do. If you've ever seen pictures or like actual pictures of human development, yet we don't look real human in the early stages. But it's not quite as drastic as it's made out to be here. That we just look so very similar to all organisms. There are definitely some similarities, especially when you look amongst like mammals. There's some similarities to how we develop, but not quite so pervasive throughout like the entire animal kingdom. There's a lot more difference than these pictures tend to show. We can also look at similarities with genetics. So there's, of course, the universal genetic code. All organisms are using the same code. We use it in the same way that pretty much all organisms take DNA, we make RNA, and then turn that into a protein. And then we have homologous molecules. So proteins that are the same, that are found in the same genes. Gene sequences that are exactly the same or very, very similar between organisms to make very similar proteins. Proteins and other molecules that have similarities to them across organisms. So I can't think of a good example. I guess insulin. It's like all mammals would probably have insulin. And so you can trace that back to the gene that would code for their insulin, and the genes would be very similar no matter which animals you're looking at. If you're looking at their insulin gene, you're going to have some similarities. They would be very, not necessarily identical, but they would be very, very chemically similar. So this is one example of actually being able to see natural selection happen. So this is an experiment that was done, and by experiment, it was an observational experiment. So they were just observing what was happening. Peter and Rosemary Grant on the Galapagos Islands, they were studying finches. Finches are birds. And they noted these variations in beak size and shape and correlated that to different foods that they would eat. Well, then there happened to be a big drought. And so the variation in their beak size and shape allowed for differences in fitness, because the ones who had, so the drought affected the seeds in the plants. And so a lot of the seeds that the finches normally would eat were not available. So the finches that could eat different seeds, that their beak size and shape would allow them to eat, especially like really hard seeds, those were the ones that got to survive and reproduce. Okay, and the ones that couldn't break through those really hard seeds, they died because they couldn't eat. Okay, so we get evolution, we get natural selection. The environment changed. There was variation in this trait that allowed some of our organisms to survive because they could change what they were eating. Okay, so individual finches with different beak size had either a better or a worse chance of surviving that drought because they could either eat a different food or they couldn't. And those that could eat a different food were more likely to survive. So the grants actually got to document that natural selection was happening. We had this change because there was a sudden change in the environment. So we discovered that sometimes natural selection can happen very quickly, especially when the environment suddenly changes. And that the variation within these organisms increases the chances that that population gets to survive. Okay, because some of our individuals within the population have an adaptation that will let the whole population survive. Okay, so not every individual gets to survive, but our species gets to survive. Our population gets to survive. So we are kind of to the point of where we're evaluating evolutionary theory. Microevolution, very definitely a thing where species are changing over time. For instance, the finches, right? So as that drought progressed, especially the longer it went on, you would find more and more finch birds with the bigger, stronger beaks because they were the ones that got to survive. So um, microevolution, change within a species over time, totally a thing. Whether or not we count it as, macroevolution, where we're not creating, but where one um, species is becoming a different species, that gets a little more complicated. Okay. Um, but in general, most of science is, when they're evaluating evolution, they're questioning, they're looking at how does it work, not whether it works or whether or not it happens. Um, most of science will um, most of science will agree that evolution is a real thing. Again, microevolution, totally a thing. Macroevolution, not so much. So that is the end of this lesson. We'll do chapter 17 next. So the next video lesson that you'll see will be on chapter 17. But we have covered all of chapter 16 that we're going to cover. You probably have a lab to do with this. That should be next, I think.